Here, chapter 14, all right, and this is all about Westward Expansion. Now, last week sometime, I forgot exactly what day it was, I gave you guys your handouts for chapters 14 and 15, right? And as always, it's important, ladies, that you read through those chapter themes and summaries and character sketches. Those things are important for you. And this kind of goes along with what we're talking about. Now, this information that I'm going to give you today will help you not only with the assessment that you're working on in class today, so maps, but also the essay cue that you're going to get tomorrow. Okay, it's all about Westward Expansion. So, right off the bat, we need to understand that if we're talking about Westward Expansion during this time frame, if we're talking about chapter 14, essentially we're talking here from, I don't know, about the 1820s to the 1850s or so. But if we look over here at the map above Houston's head, it's important that when we talk about Westward Expansion or the frontier at this time, that we remember that we're talking about this part of the country right here, okay? And I know this is a difficult conception to make, that this is the frontier, that the middle part of the country here is the West. But ladies, in the 1840s, this was the West. So when we talk about people pushing Westward Expansion, we're talking about people coming from the East Coast, where they had lived now at this time for a couple of hundred years, and pushing into the interior of the continent. And there is a two-word phrase that encapsulates that entire idea really nicely. What is that two-word phrase? That's on the board already.
Westward Expansion.
That is incorrect. The idea that the United States was going to occupy
manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny. Thank you very much. This is what we're talking about here, is manifest destiny. Remember, the United States is going to occupy all of North America between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and between our borders with Canada and Mexico. Right? Mallory, I'm going to give you 3 or 4 more minutes and then we'll give it to you. You taking it here while I'm talking? Is that going to bother you? Good. All right, so one of the things we need to understand right off the bat is some things that happened. Obviously, there was dispossession of Native Americans. This is something that we've talked about before. Some of you incorporated this into your essay for contextualization when you wrote about the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. And remember, displacement and dispossession kind of go hand in hand when it comes to Native Americans. To be displaced means that you are moved someplace else, either from your own volition or at the point of a bayonet. But what about dispossession? What does that mean? What did people take from Native Americans? Their land. This is what this was all about. As European Americans moved into the frontier, dispossession of Native Americans took place. Those people, unfortunately, had to go someplace else. Some of them fought and died. Some of them tried their best to assimilate into white culture. But the vast majority of them either moved to other areas of the country or they were rounded up and put on reservations. And we're going to continue to talk about that aspect of American history, chronologically speaking, right up until the dawn of the 20th century. Okay? So dispossession of Native Americans was something that was commonplace. We also need to remember that lands were acquired in a variety of ways. The United States got this territory through several different means. One is annexation. Who knows what that means? If a government annexes a territory, what has it done? Hazard a guess?
It takes it.
You take it, that's it. That's what annexation means. And as the United States continued to expand west, they simply took a lot of territory. Land that at one time had belonged to Native Americans. We'll talk about some different types of annexations as we get a little bit further along. But a lot of land that the United States now inhabits simply was taken. We just took it. The United States also got land through war. Now, I know we didn't talk about this a whole lot last week, but they mentioned it in the video that we watched last Thursday. What war in particular gave the United States Texas? The Mexican-American War, right? When the United States fought Mexico, we acquired Texas and parts of Arizona and New Mexico as well. So we'll talk some more about how the United States acquired land through war. You could make an argument that we got land originally through war. Because who did we take it from? Great Britain, exactly, with the American Revolution. But then the United States also bought territory. We've talked about one big purchase in particular already. What was that? The Louisiana Purchase, of course. We'll learn here in just a little while about something called the Gadsden Purchase, where the United States got some territory in the Northwest. When we talk about American expansionism, we'll talk about how the United States got Alaska. How did we get Alaska? We bought it. We bought it from Russia. How did we get Hawaii? It's on the board up here. Did we win it in a war? We just took it. Congratulations, Hawaiians. You're Americans now. Mahalo. They were very happy about it. Okay? So as the United States expanded, we got this territory, again, in a variety of ways. We also need to know that the topography of the territory that we took was, as it says up here, irrevocably altered. What does that mean if something is irrevocable?
It can't be changed back.
You can't go back, right? I know it's terrible, isn't it?
Sure.
All right. Now, what is topography? I know we got some FFA types in here. If we're talking about topography, what are we talking about? How the land, how it lays, how it looks, right? Sometimes you can look at a topographical map and you can see kind of undulations in the land, whether there's hills or mountains or valleys or rivers or whatever. But you can also talk about land topographically in terms of how it looks to the eye. Now, I want you to think about that video that we watched last Thursday, specifically with regards to the state of Indiana. They talked about that in that video. As European Americans moved west, for example, when they got to Indiana, Indiana was forested, almost the entire state. Today, if you drive through Indiana, there are lots of trees, there are some forests, but most of the land in Indiana is used for what? Farming, exactly. And so how did they clear that land to make it suitable for farming? They cut down the trees and they dug up the roots and they tilled up the soil, and now they made it into farmland, into pastures rather than forests. And as Americans moved west, the topography of the land was altered irrevocably. Millions and millions of trees were cut down so that people could grow crops instead of have some shade. Now, one state in the Union above all others is a really good example of how that process took place. Has anybody in here ever been to Iowa?
No.
Well, you're not missing much. Okay. People in Iowa are nice, but here's a stat that might blow your mind. 95% of the land in Iowa, 95% of all of the territory in that one state is under cultivation. That means they're growing stuff on it. It's used for farming. The other 5%, roads, houses, schools, a tree here or there. But if you go to Iowa and you drive across the state, what are you gonna see for miles and miles and miles and miles? Crops, farmland, corn, soybeans, nothing else. There's not a whole lot there. That's a good example of how this land was changed. But we also need to remember that there were some things that allowed for Americans to move west a little bit more easily. Now, we're going to talk about the steamboat itself here in a little while when I talk about rocket propulsion. But you might remember that video from last Thursday where a young Abraham Lincoln was on a raft in the Mississippi River, and here comes the steamboat. Had a huge impact on how Americans lived their lives. Because what could you put on a steamboat?
A lot.
A lot of people and
Things.
stuff, exactly. It allowed for trade to go a little bit more smoothly. It allowed for the movement of people to go a little bit more smoothly. And steamboats were incredibly important in that regard. We also saw the building of canals all across the United States, particularly in the east. Now, you've heard of canals before. Somebody tell me a famous canal somewhere.
Panama.
Panama Canal, maybe the Suez Canal. These are essentially man-made rivers, okay? And when we get to the Panama Canal, we talk about Teddy Roosevelt, we're gonna watch a little video of people traversing the Panama Canal. But here in the United States, canals were built to connect cities with bodies of water. And the most famous canal that was built in the United States during this time frame connected New York City with the Great Lakes. In fact, it goes into one lake particular after which this canal is named. The Erie Canal, very good. So when we talk about canals, the Erie Canal was largely responsible for making New York City the booming metropolis that it is. It had a good port already, but when goods could get from New York City to the Great Lakes or vice versa, huge, huge impact on American society. This allowed for not only more people, but more things, more stuff to move west as well. And you'll see this when you work on these little map activities here in just a little. What about a turnpike? Does anybody know what a turnpike is? Somebody does. A turnpike is a road, but today we would call it a toll road. And if you've ever been on a toll road, what do you have to do to drive on? You have to pay. You have to pay to go on that road, right? Sometimes, if you're down in Florida, there's the Florida Turnpike that's over to Orlando. If you go to Oklahoma, you can go on the Oklahoma Turnpike, one of the nicest roads I've ever driven on in my life. Speed limit is 85 miles an hour.
So like, when we drove to Colorado, so when you go through like, and we stopped in Oklahoma, like all those like interstates where we had to stop.
Yeah, every time you gotta stop, that's a toll road. Well, here's the thing about toll roads and why they were built at this time. If you have to pay to travel a road, usually that means that road is pretty well maintained, right? Nobody's gonna pay to go on a road that isn't a very good road. So these turnpikes had a big impact in terms of allowing, again, the movement of people and material. We still have turnpikes today, but you gotta put this in context with how most roads were back in the early 1800s. What do you think most roads were made out of in the early 1800s?
Dirt.
Dirt, exactly. And there's nothing wrong with a dirt road. I've been on lots of dirt roads in my life and had some good times on some dirt roads. But when it rains, what do those dirt roads turn into? Mud. Now, mud roads, not so good for transportation. Might be fun if you got a four-wheel drive, but they're not good for transportation. So turnpikes, when people built actual roads and then made people pay to go on them, once again facilitated the movement of both people and material. Now, I know that seems like a long time ago, but we still have lots of dirt roads here in the state of Georgia. I used to work in a little town called Hazelhurst down in South Georgia below the gnat line. And when it rained there, if it rained heavily enough, they would close school for students. Something like 90% of the kids that went to school in Jeff Davis County rode the school bus. Almost all of them lived on dirt roads. And when it rained heavily, those roads turned to mud. The buses couldn't get through them, and so they closed school. And we had rain days all the time. Teachers had to go, but there was no students. All right, last thing on the board up here in terms of the American system. Remember, this was Henry Clay's idea. I should have talked about that to start with. Anybody remember old Henry Clay in the American system? Designed to improve the things that we're talking about: roads, canals, ports. And what do we call those things collectively? They are transportation networks. It starts with an I. Infrastructure. So all of these things, these improvements in infrastructure through Henry Clay's American system had a big impact. But the one that had the biggest impact of all is, of course, the locomotive, which is a fancy way of saying what? A train. Now you guys are going to read about and answer some questions about trains today. We'll talk much more about trains in that transportation network when we get to the period after the Civil War and learn about the Transcontinental Railroad. But once again, this facilitated the movement of people and goods west. When we talk about westward expansion, we saw in that video last Thursday people traveling on wagon trains Well, if you could put things on an actual train, it was much more efficient, much more productive, and a whole lot easier on the people who were moving west. Okay? So, westward expansion, make sure you know Native Americans were displaced and dispossessed. The United States acquired lands in a variety of ways. They changed the land Americans did when they moved out west, and a lot of that westward expansion was due to these improvements in infrastructure. Next, we need to talk just a little bit about demography, okay, the demographics of the United States. Now, right off the bat, you need to know that in the period prior to the Civil War, the United States was overwhelmingly young and overwhelmingly what? Maybe, if they're young, that goes hand in hand. Starts with a WH. White. The United States was about 85% white, actually for most of our history. I know this is hard for you guys to envision, but well into the 1970s, the United States was 75% white. Our laws changed with regards to immigration, and what demographers refer to as the browning of America started in the 1970s. People moved here from South America and Central America, from Africa and from Asia. But up until that point, the United States was overwhelmingly a white nation. And today, we're still a majority white nation. We know what percentage of our population is white in the United States?
It's changing.
It's changing. It's about 60%, okay? So it's gone from about 75% when I was born to about 60% today. Census takers and demographers expect that the United States will be a majority-minority nation by 2050. So in 25 years, what that means is that white people will not be the majority group, but if you add together Asians and Hispanics and people of African origin, they will account for 51% of the population, right? So in your lifetime, things are gonna change. I might be alive 25 years from now. I might not. Thank you, Turtle, I appreciate that. All right. So white people today are about 60% of the population, which I know is hard for you guys to think about, but here's another crazy number. Does anybody know what percentage of the population in the United States is African American?
Isn't it like 14?
14%, that's it. Yes, dead serious. In the United States, African Americans account for 14% of the population, which is hard for us to envision here in the state of Georgia, but if you went to Iowa, or Vermont, or Wyoming, it wouldn't be hard to envision that effect, okay? But in the United States, at this time, the United States was overwhelmingly young and overwhelmingly white. In fact, here's a crazy statistic. In the decade prior to the Civil War, in the 1850s, over half of the population was under the age of 30. Just think about that. In the 1850s, in the United States, over half of the population was under the age of 30. So when Ms. Cavender said that people were overwhelmingly stupid, you weren't far off.
Wait, so you said half the population?
Half the population was under the age of 30. Is it that way today in the United States?
No.
Not at all. How many guys go to church on Sunday? Bunch of old people there. Right? Go to Walmart. The geriatrics are everywhere. Okay? But in the 1850s, the United States was different that way. And that has to do with a couple of trends. First and foremost, we were still a brand new nation at this time. And when we talk about immigration, what type of people typically leave their homes and go someplace else? Young people. They're trying to start off in life. They're trying to do something different. Okay? And that plays into these numbers up here on the board. In 1790, the year after George Washington was elected president, there were only 4 million Americans. By 1860, the year before the Civil War started, there were 31 million Americans. So a pretty big increase in a short amount of time.
So how many do we have now?
That's an excellent question. Who wants to answer that? How many Americans are there in the United States today, according to the census. Now, the census isn't complete because there's a lot of people that aren't counted in the census.
Is it like 400?
350 million.
Holy shit.
Now, if you included people that weren't counted by the census, I bet it would be closer to 400.
That's too many.
So, estimates are that some 20 million people have crossed our borders in just the last 2 years. So we're growing exponentially. Not sure that's a good thing. But here's the key. These 31 million Americans in 1860, how did the numbers improve or go up so dramatically from 1790? There's 2 ways that you get more people.
Reproduction.
Reproduction is one. Natural reproduction was part of it. We'll talk about that here in just a second. What was the other part? Immigration. And why were people moving to the United States during this time frame? Because of westward expansion. All of this new land is opening up. There are opportunities for people to come to the United States from Europe to start a new life. People from Northern and Western Europe specifically, they came here in droves. But we also saw an increase in the natural birth rate. And a lot of that has to do with frontier life. Now remember, when we talk about the frontier, we're talking about the middle of America. But frontier life was pretty rough. All right, how many of you people, when you go home, have a roof over your head? Hopefully everybody lives in a house, or an apartment, or a trailer, or whatever the case might be, okay? Now, raise your hand again if you built that structure with your bare hands. You did. You probably had some help. Okay. All right. 1 person out of 24. All right, everybody has clothes on, thanks God. Made your clothes yourself. You lived on the frontier, you would have. Who had breakfast this morning? Turtle, what'd you have? Muffins. Did you grow the wheat? No. What kind of muffins was it? Did you grow the blueberries? No. Who else had breakfast? What'd you have? Who had something normal?
Is that not?
Was it waffles? Okay. Did you have syrup on your waffles? Did you tap those trees to get the syrup? Did you grow the wheat to make the waffles with? Okay. What I'm trying to get across to you is this. In the 1850s, people who lived on the frontier, if they had a roof over their head, they built it themselves. If they had clothes on their back, they made them themselves. If they had food in their bellies, they either grew it or raised it themselves. Okay? We take a lot of things for granted today. You guys get up and you turn on your light and it comes on. You open up the spigot and some water comes out. You open up the fridge and there's something to eat in there. On the frontier in the 1850s, everybody had to work. The toil was never ending because everybody had to provide everything that they had. And that's one of the reasons that people had so many children. Why did they have children? They needed more help on the farm. They needed people to work, exactly. Part of that was also that infant mortality was pretty high. About half of all children died before the age of 5.
Wow.
People got used to it.
Dinosaurs.
In fact, oftentimes people were cautioned not to get too attached to the baby because it's probably going to die anyway. And as a result of that, when people neglected the child, then it sometimes died. So, a vicious cycle. But life on the frontier was rough. You had to build your own house. You had to make your own clothes. You had to grow your own food. How close is your nearest neighbor? Well, not 100 miles, but probably 10 or 15 miles. Right? If you had a neighbor that was 5 miles away, that's pretty close. To get to go see that neighbor, what would you have to do? You're going to have to walk, probably. If you had a horse, you're probably using it for the farm. You're certainly not going to tire it out by going to have a social call. So, no, you wouldn't.
No.
So, in your little house that you have built yourself, wearing your homemade clothes, eating the food that you have grown, your nearest neighbors are miles and miles and miles away. Who is it that you are there with all the time? Your mother, your father, and your siblings. And those are the only people that you would see for months on end.
I go to walk every day.
Months on end. There was no leisure time. You couldn't just go for a walk. You had work to do. And here's the really bad part about that. In that one little house where everybody lived all the time, your parents needed some more hands on the farm. Exactly.
Okay.
All right, so describe frontier life for me in one word.
Weird.
Weird?
Getting down and dirty.
That's 3 words.
Alright, dirty.
It's actually 4. It's actually 4.
Last period I had someone say traumatic. That might be a good one.
Yeah.
Pretty rough. It wasn't easy at all. But we slowly started to see some changes thanks to industrialization. Now listen, we are going to talk at length about both industrialization and urbanization right around spring break, right before spring break. These two things go hand in hand. Urbanization is the growth of cities. What do you suppose that industrialization is?
The growth of
The
industry.
growth of industry. You're absolutely right. Where people were able to make things to make life a little bit easier. Okay? Now, we got some important inventors up here on the board. I'm gonna roll through these pretty quickly, and then I'm gonna give you your assignment for today. And if at that time you gotta go to the bathroom, you can. So our first name on the board here, Eli Whitney. I know that when I say Eli Whitney, most people are gonna say what?
Cotton.
The cotton gin. And that's true. Eli Whitney did invent the cotton gin, and we'll talk about its impact here in just a second. But before he invented the cotton gin, Eli Whitney pioneered the use of something called interchangeable parts. And that sounds just exactly like what it is. Interchangeable parts means these are parts that are interchangeable. If one part of your machine breaks, you just get a new one and fix it. Which was brand new in the early 1800s. Up until Eli Whitney's kind of codification of this process, things were made by hand, one at a time. And so if you got a gun, if that gun had been made by a gunsmith, that one gun all together at once. And if the firing pin broke, you might be able to craft another one that you could fit in there, and you might not. You might just have to get a whole new gun. Your wagon was made one at a time, and if the axle broke, you might be able to fix it, you might not. Imagine if it were still that way today. How many of you guys have ever had a flat tire on your vehicle? Time to get a new car. Have you ever had a shoestring break? Gotta get some new shoes. Got a leak in your roof? Gotta get a new house. That's an extreme example, but you get the idea. So here's how Eli Whitney developed interchangeable parts. There was a contract for weaponry for the United States War Department. Eli Whitney wanted that contract, he'd make a bunch of money. But he knew that if he was going to do that, he had to do something a little bit different. To make a bunch of guns one at a time was gonna be too difficult. So he pioneered this process of making them all the same. Went to Washington DC, bureaucrat said, what do you got there, Mr. Whitney? And he said, I got all these rifles here and they are all exactly the same. And the guy laughed at him. He said, it's not a thing. What are you talking about? They're all the same. And so he disassembled them. He put all the stocks in one box, and he put all the barrels in a different box, and he put all the triggers in a different box, and all the sights in a different box, and the firing pins in a different one, so on and so forth. And then he had the guy from the government go and get one thing from each one of those boxes. He assembled the gun, put a bullet in it, and it fired, and that proved that this was a real thing. Guess who got the contract? Eli Whitney. Okay? But it also changed how Americans and everybody else around the world made goods, and that had a huge impact on the amount of stuff that we could make. Now, as far as the cotton gin is concerned, this was a pretty simple little device that's not very big. There's actually, if you want to look at it in that red book under your desk, you don't necessarily have to, but in page 216, or on page 216, you can see what the cotton gin looks like. It's pretty small. It's got a handle that you crank. And what does a cotton gin do? Doesn't pick cotton. It cleans cotton, you're absolutely right. The most labor-intensive part of cotton production was taking the seeds out of the cotton boll. It took forever. They're sticky, they got little kind of like thorns on them, hurt people's hands. And so it took a lot of time and a lot of labor to clean those seeds out so that you could have pure cotton to make clothing. His little device here, you put the cotton in there, you crank this handle, and all the seeds fall out. Now, a lot of people, quiet please ladies, think that because of the invention of the cotton gin, that we saw a decrease in the number of enslaved people in the United States. But in fact, the opposite is true. Because what happened was this: when people realized that they could clean cotton more quickly, guess what they did with a bunch of land that they had? They planted more cotton. And in fact, the cotton gin led to the advent of what we refer to as king cotton. And we'll talk about that in the run-up to the Civil War. Eli Whitney's device, one might have thought, would have been the death knell for the institution of slavery. Unfortunately, that was not the case. In fact, slavery was just about on the way out until the cotton gin, and then we got many, many more enslaved people in the United States. What about the next guy on our list here? Samuel F.B. Morse. What did he invent? Morse code is used on the typewriter, the telegraph. You're thinking of semaphore, flags. It's on that. The telegraph. This had a huge impact on communication. Remember, we talked about the American colonies. It took 3 months to get a message from one side of the Atlantic to the other. Eventually, they laid telegraph cables under the Atlantic Ocean. But here in the United States, this made people be able to communicate just like that, almost instantaneously. Morse code is a series of dots and dashes. There's a little device where you press it down, and people who are trained in this can listen to it, and then they can decipher that code, right? Kind of like an early runner of the telephone. You could get messages across a long distance almost instantaneously, okay? Big, big impact on not only the movement of troops during war, but also the movement of goods and people. Let people know if there was a storm brewing up, whatever the case might be. Now, interestingly enough, where do you think Americans strung these telegraph wires when this became a thing?
Along the roads.
What type of road?
Railroad.
Railroads. You're absolutely right. Telegraph wires were almost always strung beside railroad tracks for two reasons. Number one, the trees had already been cleared. Very easy to sink a post and put the wires on top of it. But there's another reason as well. Nope, we didn't have electricity yet, not like that. Easier to fix, you're absolutely right, because if one broke, what would you get on to go fix it? A train. And if you're on the train, you could see if one of the wires was down, then you could let people know. And moreover, guess where a lot of telegraph stations were? Train stations, exactly. So the telegraph and the locomotive go kind of hand in hand. What about Elias Howe? Anybody ever heard of him? He invented something that saved people all across the country a lot of time, but particularly women on the frontier. What he came up with was the sewing machine. And I would venture to guess that some of you in here have a sewing machine in your house, or your grandma does. When I took home economics in high school at about your age, we had to learn how to sew on a sewing machine.
It's pretty easy.
It's not hard. I learned a lot of things in that class that helped me out in my life. And you know why I took it, guys? Because I was the only guy in the class. It worked out well for me. The sewing machine, though, had a huge impact, right?
What?
Women could do things more quickly. Now, today, sewing machines are electric. Back then, how did sewing machines run? A foot pedal, right? You just kind of pump your foot, spin this thing around. Look, I remember my mother, when I was young, we didn't have a whole lot of money. My mom used to make my clothes, well until going into first and second grade. Had little patterns, she would buy material, sew up shirts and shorts and pants for them.
At least nobody else had the same outfits.
I don't know that I was concerned about that in any way, shape, or form. I don't think little 6-year-old me was like, oh my God, he's got the same shirt. She used to make my Halloween costume. She was pretty cool. All right, what about Cyrus McCormick? Don't say the Spice Guys. That's not true.
Oh. Wait, it's not.
You're close. It is the mechanical, and be careful how you say this last word, mechanical. The mechanical reaper is this word. The mechanical reaper. There's an E in there.
Reaper. It is very close.
Reaper.
What? Oh.
Now, how many of you guys are familiar with the Grim Reaper? Everybody's seen an image of the Grim Reaper at some point. Very tall figure, always dressed in black with a hood. You can't see his face. And what is it that the Grim Reaper is carrying in his hand? A scythe, exactly, which is a great big curved blade on a stick. And if you didn't know this, a scythe was traditionally used for reaping wheat.
Oh, yeah.
If I had 10 acres of wheat grown, the only way to cut that down was to take out my scythe and take that big blade and cut it. Pretty hard to do. Had to sharpen it pretty frequently. How long would that take me if I had just a knife and me and 10 acres to cut down all that wheat? It'll take a minute, right? But the mechanical reaper was something that could be pulled behind a horse that would cut down that wheat for you. And what would that do for you as a farmer? It's going to speed up your process. You're going to be more productive. You're going to be more efficient, which means that you can grow more wheat. And if you can grow more wheat, you can sell more wheat. And if you can sell more wheat, you can make more money. And that's what everybody wants to do. So this had a huge impact on people moving west as well, particularly people who lived on the frontier, those farmers who went out there to try and make a living.
John Deere.
John Deere, don't say the tractor. It's a company today, a tractor company. Well, what did John Deere invent?
Plow,
What kind of plow?
longboard plow?
The steel plow.
Okay.
Plows traditionally have been made out of wood or of soft metals. And if you were trying to plow in soft ground, that was fine. But as Americans moved west out onto the Great Plains into the prairie, the land still today in North Dakota, in South Dakota, in Minnesota, in Iowa, in Nebraska, incredibly dense, very, very hard, oftentimes still kind of frozen. The steel plow allowed for farmers to till up that soil and then grow. You got that, Caitlin? The steel plow. What about the tractor?
He didn't make it.
Yeah, he did. You're right, he did. Okay? So John Deere had a big impact on this as well. Finally up here, one last person, Robert Fulton. He was the person who first developed a steam boat. Now the steam engine had been pioneered in Great Britain, I don't know, 60, 70 years previously. But it was Robert Fulton who pioneered a process to put that engine on a boat and allow boats to sail both up and down river. And his very first steamboat, you don't necessarily need to remember this, was called the Clermont. And when it went on its maiden voyage in 1820, whatever it was, up the Hudson River in New York, people came from miles around to watch this boat go upriver, something they hadn't really seen before. And they were amazed at how fast it was going. Blew people's minds. You know how fast it was going?
About 5 miles per hour.
Exactly 5 miles per hour. Which is about as fast as you walk. Well, I don't know, some of you walk slow. Some of us walk fast. And just so you know, as you get older, your gait speed, as that is called, is a very good indicator of your cognitive ability.
What?
Gait speed,
What is
how
that?
fast you walk.
Like
That's
that.
your gait. This is my gait, right? My gait speed. If you've ever seen an older person who kind of walks like this,
Oh.
they're having issues not only physically but mentally. Ooh, look, that's. You want to see my impersonation of Joe Biden?
Oh my God.
I'm gonna start writing that.
Wait, so when older
That's a
people,
pretty good one.
I thought it was just like their hips and stuff, but.
It has to do with their physical nature and their cognitive ability. It goes, your mind, when your mind starts to go, your gait speed slows down. So be careful. In fact, all of you should walk faster than you do.
Okay.
It's good for you, in all seriousness. All right, one last thing on the board up here, and that is patent increases. Now, who knows what a patent is? What do you get a patent for?
To have a business.
Don't necessarily have to have a patent to have a
Like
business,
an
but you might help.
invention. Like you own the invention, like you
You
made
own
it.
an invention, and that's key. A patent is issued for something that is physical, something that you can hold in your hand, something that you have made to help you, maybe, Caitlin, start a business. And that's a little bit different from intellectual property. If you are an artist, or if you've written a novel, or if you've written a screenplay or a song, you don't get a patent for that, you get what's called a copyright, okay? And what that means is that people can't steal your intellectual property. A patent is something where people can't steal your invention. In the year 1800 in the United States Patent Office issued a total of 306 patents. There are 300 things that were created in the year 1800 that warranted a patent. In the 1850s, now we're talking about the entire decade, we saw some 28,000 patents issued in the United States, which is a pretty significant increase. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that, okay? One is those demographic changes that we talked about a little bit earlier. There were more people here in the United States, which means that there's more brain power, which means that more people are thinking about different ways to do things. But there's something else that's really important here for the number of patents, and that is that invention begets invention. When somebody figures out a new way to do something, other times people then figure out a way to improve upon that, or to make it a little bit better.
How do you spell beget?
B-E-G-E-T. So we saw a huge increase in the number of patents that were issued in the United States because of an influx of people, because of an influx of brain power, and because of the fact that there were simply more inventions that people started doing. Here in a couple of months, we'll talk about Thomas Edison. Are you familiar with Thomas Edison? In his lifetime, he alone had 1,096 patents, just Thomas Edison. He invented almost 1,100 things that were good enough to get a patent. Pretty smart dude. Know what else he did? I just like the story. When Thomas Edison was gonna hire someone to work for them, or for him rather, the Edison company, he would invite them to dinner. And then he would watch them. And if they seasoned their food prior to tasting it, they weren't gonna get the job.
What?
They were out of the running right then.
Before they tasted it?
Yeah. How come?
Because you don't know what it tastes like.
They haven't tasted it yet, exactly. That's not a very good scientific mind, is it? I'm just gonna put salt on this, I don't even know what it tastes like. Pretty smart guy. Don't look at me like that. Do you put salt on it? Salt is bad for you. Don't be picking up the salt shaker.
And pepper and other fish in it.
There's enough salt in the food that you eat. Don't ever have to pick up a salt shaker.
If I don't think there is, then there's not.
Well, then you need to cut down on your sodium intake, lest your heart explode.
Well, then let it explode.
Okay, that's one. You've been warned.
Alright, move back.
Hold on, don't go yet.
That was that four.
I can't help it, I'm sorry.
And that